Hello! Today I am bringing you my August wrap-up. In the month of August, I participated in the Newt's Readathon and participated in some of the challenges, and I didn't get as far as I was hoping. I read 20 books. So I'm going to go through the books, and then I will tell you which challenges I completed and didn't complete. The first book I read was Rick and Morty Volume 1. I actually read all the Rick and Mortys this month, so I'll just go through them quick. Volume 1 I gave 4 stars. Volume 2 I gave 4 stars. Volume 3 I gave 3 stars. Volume 4 I gave 5 stars. Volume 5 I gave 3 stars. Volume 6 I gave 3 stars. And Volume 7 I gave 2.5 stars. I find that the Rick and Morty episodes are also kind of hit or miss, but I did find that after the 4th volume, the comic series sort of declined. It became quite derivative and very repetitive, and I just didn't enjoy reading them. It was kind of a chore to pick them up after that. Overall, I don't really recommend them past Volume 4. I still need to read Little Poopy Superstar, which is about Mr. Poopy Butthole. And I also saw on Twitter from Pat Rothfuss that he just wrote a Dungeons & Dragons version of the comics, and I really want to read those because I like Pat Rothfuss more so than because I want to actually continue the series. Other than Rick and Morty, there are 3 other books that I read during the Booktubeathon, so I will link my Booktubeathon vlog down below, but those were Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, and Poet X, which I did a book talk on, and I will link that down below as well. The next book I read was actually an audiobook, and that's Crushing It by Gary Vaynerchuk. Gary Vaynerchuk, if you don't know, is a business leader and a thought leader in the business community. Crush It, which is the book that precedes Crushing It, is all about building a business, and Crushing It is sort of another step of that, like building a brand and all that kind of stuff. And I gave that one 5 stars. I love Gary Vaynerchuk's books because he's really good at writing business books that are very manageable and relatable. The next book I read was Winter of Red Snow, which is a Dear America book. These are epistolary historical fiction. They're just basically diary entries of fictional characters that lived during the time that it's about. So this one was about a girl who lived near Valley Forge during the winter of Valley Forge when the Revolutionary Army was staying there and everything that happened that winter. The story of the winter of Valley Forge is interesting in itself, but this was the story of an outsider, so basically a girl who lived in the village next to where the soldiers were staying. So it was interesting, but I think it would have been more interesting if it was written by someone who was more like a first-hand experience of being a soldier and not having shoes and coats and things like that. This one I gave 3 stars, partially because when I'm reading a historical fiction novel, I don't mind if they use contemporaneous language, but sometimes it feels very forced, and in this case it felt very, very forced. That kind of irritated me. I also think it would have been more interesting, like I said, from a soldier's perspective, and if it was in prose. The next book I read was another audiobook, and that's David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell. I gave this one 5 stars. Malcolm Gladwell is a psychologist, I think, and he writes a lot of things that tend to be thought of as business books and thought leadership. This one was about the advantages that you actually get from being disadvantaged and how underdogs can use the placement of being an underdog in order to win. It's not only interesting because of the subject matter, but also because you can, if you really take what he talks about and apply it to the other aspects of your life, it would completely transform the way you lead, parent, and teach. The next book I read was another audiobook, and that was Nevertheless by Alec Baldwin. I've mentioned multiple times that I'm kind of a junkie for celebrity memoirs because we get a story about them from the media's perspective, and it's really nice to get their side. And in this case it was really interesting because Alec Baldwin was really transparent about his faults. I'm always distrustful of any biography that seems a little bit too positive or a little bit too much like the memoir is very, I'm a victim. So I think probably the truth with a capital T is probably somewhere in between his rendition of the story and the media's rendition of the story. And this one actually almost felt like he was using it as sort of a therapeutic thing, like he was using his memoir to make sense of everything that has happened in his life. He also seems to understand that he doesn't really get along with everyone, and he kind of accepts that. Like, he's not saying it's okay that he didn't get along with people, but he's not saying there were jerks and that's why. He seems to understand that there are just some personality clashes that have happened in his past, and I really appreciate that he doesn't tell his brother's stories. He mentions them when it matters in a story about his life, but he doesn't tell their story, which I thought was really good because it's not his story to tell, it's their story to tell. And I gave this 5 stars. The next one I'm a little scared to talk about because it's such a popular book, but this one I also listened to on audiobook, and that is Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. And I know that this one is so beloved, but I gave it 3 stars. Even though it was audiobook, which I don't usually have to push myself through, I did have to push myself through on this one. Partially because, although I understand it was meant to be Kath's fan fiction from Fangirl, I didn't expect it to read like fan fiction, and it did. It was kind of subpar. I felt like it needed a bit more editing, and it took me about 60% of the book to actually become invested in the story and the characters. I did like Simon and Baz's relationship, which is probably why I started becoming more invested. I'm into the plot enough to probably read the second one, but overall I wasn't really impressed. Everyone raves about this book, and I just felt like, even forgetting the fact that it feels very much like every other fantasy novel, which was the point. It's supposed to be an archetypal story, sort of based on all these tropes that come up in fantasy, but the characters just fell kind of flat for me. I wasn't impressed with their development. Other than the Simon and Baz relationship, I really just didn't care. The next one I read was another audiobook, and that was Believe Me by Yolanda Hadid. This is her memoir about her struggle with Lyme disease. Once again, celebrity memoir, kind of a junkie for them. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's really hard to rate someone's memoir because it feels like you're judging their life. There were just a few things that bothered me, but otherwise I really did enjoy it. And like I said, it's always great to get their side of the story. It was very powerful and emotional, and I think it would affect anyone who has dealt with a chronic illness, not just Lyme disease. I felt a small connection to this one because I was misdiagnosed with Lyme disease when I was younger. The next one I read was another audiobook. There was one week where I just kind of flew through several audiobooks because of what was going on at work. That one was The Woman in the Window by AJ Finn. This is a thriller sort of on the lines of like Gone Girl or Luckiest Girl Alive, like in that vein, which is kind of on trend right now. I gave it 3.5 stars, and that was because it was a bit slow, but the twists were good. Certain things were slightly predictable, but other things totally caught me off guard. And it is hard when this is kind of on trend right now, because you read so many that they start to sort of fall into patterns, which can get frustrating. There are definitely certain tropes that show up in a lot of these books that I'm getting to the point where I'm getting sick of them, and they need to kind of phase out at this point. The next book I read was The Mermaid by Carolyn Turgeon. I gave this one 3 stars, mainly because it was a bit slow and it just kind of wasn't the style of writing I usually like to read. This was a dual perspective, which I normally don't mind, but I kind of struggled with this one for some reason. It didn't really make sense until the end. Like, I feel like it didn't need it until the end, but it did stay really close to the original fairy tale. But it even included like the immense pain in her legs. The prince and the princess in the story were both really irritating. The mermaid was okay, but she was a bit naive, which also kind of got irritating, while at the same time kind of making sense because she's not from this world. And even like the characters made it feel fairy tale like, because they weren't very developed. They were kind of flat like in fairy tales, and there wasn't a lot of character development. The plot was kind of flat. The writing style was very fairy tale-esque. Basically, it was a little bit too long for that style for my taste, so that's why I got 3.5 stars. It wasn't like bad. If you enjoy that kind of thing, you probably would like it. And then I kind of went into a reading slump. So, kind of pulled me out of it. I decided to pick up Herding Cats by Sarah Scribbles, aka Sarah Anderson. I read her comics on the internet sometimes, but obviously you miss some when you just pick them up on Pinterest every so often. So I like reading her books because it's a compilation of all her internet cartoons, I think. This one also includes an essay at the back about how artists can survive. It's like an essay with cartoons. So how to survive as an artist in the internet and with dealing with imposter syndrome and all that kind of stuff. I give this one 4.5 stars. I have the same complaint with this one as I have with the other one. Because it's just a compilation of like daily comics, it does feel kind of mishmashed. While I find them really enjoyable and really relatable, sometimes going from page to page, it's so disjointed that it's weird to read it in one sitting. So I definitely recommend all of her books. I think she's great. And her comics are always super heartwarming and relatable. And the last book I read this month, because I wanted to watch the movie, let's be transparent here, I only read it because I wanted to watch the movie, was To All the Boys I Loved Before by Jenny Han. I gave this one 3.5 stars, which I'm sure is another unpopular opinion because I know everyone loves it. There's nothing wrong with it per se, like it's not a bad book. If you like this kind of book, you would probably like it, but I don't, and I know better. I don't mind watching rom-com movies, although they're not my favorite, but I don't mind them. I really enjoy like Drive Me Crazy and How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days and other movies like that. I even love Something Borrowed, which I tried to get through the book and I got through like one chapter and I was basically done. I might try that one again. I'm sidetracked. Anyway, when I picked those up, I knew I probably wouldn't enjoy it that much, which sounds really close-minded, but I wanted to enjoy it. I just was kind of afraid that I wouldn't, and I didn't hate it, but I had the same problem with this that I have with most contemporaries, that I felt like there wasn't really a plot. And normally when there's not really much of a plot, there's a ton of character development, so it kind of makes up for the lack of plot. But I felt like there wasn't really even character development in this one, and the part of the plot that was a plot a little bit was sort of over kind of quick. It did definitely feel like an 80s Hughes movie, like 16 Candles. Like you could definitely tell that Jenny Han pulled inspiration from like classic rom-coms, which was kind of fun. And there's a lot of pop culture references that are really fun in here too. But I also felt like Lara Jean was kind of a brat, and the whole thing between her and Josh was like super weird. And then I loved Peter so as a character, so the way she treated him really irritated me, and I kept thinking like I would have to like drag myself through it, and I was thinking like I don't even know if I'm going to finish this one, let alone read the others. And then by the time I got to the end, I was invested enough in the characters that I probably will have to pick up the other two books just to find out what happens, which is nice because I ended up enjoying the last bit, but it's frustrating because I don't enjoy this type of book. And now I want to know what happens. So that's all the books that I read, and I'm just going to go through quickly my Newt's results. For Ancient Runes, I got an acceptable because I read a book set in the past, which was Winter of the Red Snow. For Arithmancy, I got an outstanding because I read a book more than 350 pages, nevertheless. A book that ends on an even page number, crushing it. A book that is not a first in the series, Rick and Morty Volume 3. For Care of Magical Creatures, I got an outstanding because I read a book with a creature on the cover, Rick and Morty Volume 6. A book with under 160 pages, Rick and Morty Volume 5. A book that includes dragons in any way, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. In Defense Against the Dark Arts, I got an acceptable because I read the last book in a series, Rick and Morty Volume 7. Herbology, I got an exceeds expectations because I read green on the cover, Rick and Morty Volume 1. And a book with illustrations, Rick and Morty Volume 2. History of Magic, I got an outstanding because I read a book that would fit in at Hogwarts. So for that one, Mermaid by Carolyn Turgeon. A book that was published more than 5 years ago, David and Goliath. A book more than 400 pages long, Woman in the Window. And for Transfiguration, I got an exceeds expectations. I read a book with a great cover, Believe Me by Yolanda Hadid. And a new author to you, Poet X. So potions, charms, Muggle studies, and astronomy, I didn't get anything. But overall, I think that was pretty good. My reading month wasn't that great. I feel like a lot of my books were kind of but that may have been from me and my reading mood, I suppose. Maybe my books weren't fitting with my mood. That's what's so hard about reading books. Like sometimes you don't know, is it the book or is it me? Like maybe I should reread some of them, see if my ratings change, but who knows. As always, there are so many books and so little time, so I'm gonna go read and I will see you in my next video. Bye!